Putin's war in Ukraine, Trump's threat of war against its allies. For Europe, it feels like the end of an order they assumed was permanent. But what if these two shocks, paradoxically, are exactly what Europe needs? If in reality, they're not the true fundamental problems, but a mirror held up to Europe itself. Europe is a unique continent. There, history has always moved faster, with greater force and at a higher cost. Wars, empires, revolution, a dynamic that shaped the entire world. This is why the irony is so striking. Europe is the continent that shaped history, yet after the Cold War, it began to act as if the history doesn't apply to it anymore, as if it could never happen again, as if the world has reached its final order. Europeans, on the one hand, so proud of their sophisticated knowledge of the past, yet convinced that history now belongs only to museums, for tourists to visit. After the Cold War, Europe entered an era it had never known before. A prolonged peace, prosperity, and most unusually, for the first time, the absence of any immediate threat. This combination didn't just change the policies, it changed mindset. It fundamentally reshaped how Europeans see the world. For a generation living without a threat, security became taken for granted. Power felt suspicious, something uncomfortable, almost shameful, something modern Europeans believed they no longer needed. Elites once spoke about the military with seriousness and a sense of necessity. Today, they speak about it with discomfort, or avoid the subject altogether. The question that once stood beneath all politics, are we capable of defending ourselves, has been replaced by a different one. Do we even need a military anymore? Peace is no longer understood as a balance that must be maintained, but as a natural condition, one that exists by itself, and requires no effort, no sacrifice, no vigilance. This was not a moral progress. It was a historical luxury. Europe began to see its own unpreparedness as a virtue, its weakness as a moral superiority, and for a time, this worked. Not because it was true, but because it was never challenged. This is where the crucial mistake happens. Pacifism deserves respect when it is the choice of someone who has power, but when it becomes an excuse for a weakness and a refusal to pay the price, it is cowardice. And then, Ukraine happens. Not as an ideological debate, not as a diplomatic dispute, but as a raw force. A war that reminded Europe of something very simple. History did not die. It was only waiting in ambush until it was no longer taken seriously. Ironically, Russia's initial weakness turned out to be even more dangerous. The invasion of Crimea and the war in Georgia, successful Russian actions, reinforced the belief in small, modern conflicts, almost police operations by nature, where polite diplomats eventually reach an agreement. But once the invasion of Ukraine bogged down and dragged on, something else became clear. That Russia, regardless of any moral judgment, is prepared to fight a long, brutal war. It can mobilize society. It can endure pressure. It is willing to pay the price of power. And an uncomfortable question emerges. Can Europe do the same today? Can it meet that kind of force? Match it? Not theoretically, not with numbers on paper, but in the real world, here and now. And just as pressure from the East intensified, another illusion began to collapse. The illusion that there would always be someone else, someone to keep order, someone to pay the price, to die, if necessary. And this is where Trump enters the stage. He did not create new reality. He revealed it. He made explicit what Europe was so comfortable keeping implicit. That American protection is not a moral obligation. It is a political decision. And political decisions change. Trump simply voiced what Europeans had long pushed aside. And with that, Europe was stripped of its comfortable illusions. This is the real issue. Putin and Trump are not the greatest threat to Europe. They are symptoms, they are warnings, they are external pressures that expose an internal void. The real threat to Europe is not in Moscow or Washington. The real threat lies in Europe's state of mind, in its spirit. The belief that history happens to others, that conflict belongs somewhere else, and that it can be handled with statements, resolutions, or time. Europe began to believe that once it found a comfortable place in the world would adjust itself to Europe's preferences. The moment of truth arrived. And yet, for many in Europe, the instinctive reaction is not urgency, but denial. Not mobilization, but irritation. The discomfort of being reminded that the world does not run on European assumptions. History, on the contrary, teaches us something brutal. Illusions do not end through rational arguments. They do not end through debate. False mental frameworks do not change because of logic. Almost always, they're shattered by shock, by a painful collision with reality. So the question is not whether Putin and Trump are dangerous for Europe. The real question is whether this shock is strong enough to finally wake up Europe, to force it to take power seriously again, and to pay its price. Or will Europe deny what's happening, stay in whining and moral self-pity, and hope time will fix things, without any real change? Because the next shock may not be merely humiliating, it may be final.